Hi, everyone. Welcome to Intersectional Storytelling, this session of the Queer Youth Network. Obviously, you guys have met Alice before, but my name's Kate. My pronouns are she, her, and I live and play on the lands of the Kaurna people. Alice, did you just want to go to the next slide? Yeah. Yep, so meet the facilitators. So I currently work for the Department of Climate Change. I'm also the National Chair for Amnesty International Australia's Youth Advisory Group and a member of their Gaza Crisis Group, Refugee Rights Group, and Queer Network. I wear a lot of hats when it comes to advocacy and human rights, and of course, I'm also a board member for VOI. In my spare time, I love to read books and learn. I'm neurodivergent, have an invisible disability, and I identify as queer. Alice, did you want to just say hello to everyone?
Hello everyone. Obviously you've seen my face a lot over these last few weeks. But I am Alice. I am the founder and chairperson of Voices of Influence Australia. I am currently joining you from Inverntwa Country in Central Australia, or otherwise known as Alice Springs. I have been living here for the last 6 months, and it isn't always a privilege to be able to wake up and to learn, live, breathe, play, and work on Inverntwa Country and Aranda Country. As you guys know, I'm working for the Aboriginal Legal Service up here in the Northern Territory, but originally from Gadigal Land in Sydney. And in my spare time, I'm learning to camp, which is not something which is new to me because I'm not really an outdoorsy person, but part of the lifestyle of the territory. My pronouns are she, her, and I also identify as queer.
Amazing. Okay, so I just wanted to begin by acknowledging that I am dialing in from the traditional lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, whose sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respects to Kaurna elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people whose lands we gather on today, wherever we may be across the country. For all of us across Australia, we're reminded that this land always has been and always will be a place of deep cultural significance, rich knowledge, and custodianship. First Nations people have cared for this land for tens of thousands of years, and their connection to it remains unbroken. Sovereignty was never ceded, it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. As we meet, learn, and share stories today, let us honour the wisdom and resilience of First Nations people, not just here, but across all the lands we join from. So, all right, just to the agenda for the session. So first, I'm just going to do a little bit of content. So if you've done your pre-reading, there was some information about framing of intersectional stories, data and the importance of data in intersectional storytelling and well-being in storytelling. So that's what we'll cover quickly just as a recap in a moment. We'll then go to our panel discussion. In the chat, there's a meet the panelists. And I'll also throw to them later on to introduce themselves. Then we'll have a Q&A, so feel free to pop any questions you have in the chat, and we will ask those on your behalf for you, and then we'll finish up. Awesome. So the focus areas, as I said, were the role of data, importance of framing, importance of well-being, and the role of subjective experience. All right. So I'm really excited to be with you here today to talk about intersectional storytelling and why it's such an essential tool, especially for marginalized communities like the LGBTQIA plus community. When we think about intersectionality, we're looking at the different parts of our identity. So sexuality, race, gender, ability, class, and how these parts overlap to shape our unique experiences in the world. It's vital because many of us face more than one form of discrimination at once, whether it's racism and homophobia or ableism and sexism. Intersectional storytelling helps us make sense of this complexity, and more importantly, it helps us communicate it to the world. When we share these stories, we don't just talk about our struggles, we celebrate our resilience. We challenge stereotypes that the world imposes on us, and we reclaim our identities on our own terms. This process of reframing our narratives isn't just for us, it's for others too. It fosters inclusivity within our own communities by recognizing and celebrating the diverse experiences that exist within this spectrum. It also educates our allies and advocates by showing them the real challenges we face, which does lead to more effective support. So storytelling is one of the most powerful tools we have for communicating big, complex issues like racism, transphobia, and classism. But here's the thing, humans do think in stories. If we don't provide narratives that help people understand these issues, they'll fill in the gaps with assumptions. And often these assumptions are really flawed and biased. That's why framing matters. When we get it right, our stories don't just inform, they transport people. They help others experience the world through our eyes, which is how real change happens. So, just to talk a little bit about data in intersectional storytelling. As powerful as stories are, in today's world, data is crucial too. We live in a time where misinformation and disinformation spreads really quickly. Personal stories alone aren't enough to combat that. We do need to back them up with facts and figures. That's where data comes in. It gives credibility to our stories and makes them harder to dismiss. Think of it like this. Imagine sharing a personal story about the healthcare barriers faced by queer people of colour. It is deeply moving, but now imagine adding statistics that show how racism and transphobia lead to worse health outcomes in these communities. Suddenly, you've got a narrative that's not just personal, it's factual, and it makes the systemic issues impossible to ignore. So, to make the best use of data in intersectional storytelling, here's a few key tips. So, first, lead with the story. People are emotionally drawn to stories first, so start with the personal, then bring in the data to support your point. Ensure your data is credible. Be transparent about how you collected it and use trustworthy sources. This is really important when dealing with sensitive issues like healthcare or discrimination. Present your data creatively. Data doesn't have to be boring. Use visuals, infographics, or analogies to make it relatable and easy to understand. For example, instead of saying something like 1.3 acres, you can say about the size of a football field. Make your data accessible. Think about accessibility. So use alt text for images, ensure high contrast in visuals, and break down complex stats into simple, digestible parts. And of course, a call to action. So after sharing your story and data, invite people to take action. Whether it's signing a petition, volunteering, or donating, give them a tangible way to support the cause. This combination of data and storytelling is a game changer because it connects the emotional impact of personal stories with the hard facts that people can't ignore. Together, they make our voices louder and harder to silence. Now, to finish up, I just wanted to talk a little bit about well-being in storytelling. It's really often an overlooked part of storytelling. Sharing personal stories, especially about trauma or discrimination, can be incredibly powerful, but it can also be emotionally exhausting and re-traumatizing. That's why it's really important to consider our mental health when we decide to share our stories and to make sure that the spaces we're sharing them in are supportive and respectful. Organizations like Define American offer some great guidelines for this. For example, before you share your story, ask yourself, is now a good time for me to share? How am I feeling emotionally right now? Do I feel safe? And what am I comfortable sharing? These questions help us set boundaries and ensure we're not putting our well-being at risk for the sake of advocacy, which is definitely a fine balance. On the flip side, organizations that work with storytellers need to adopt certain standards to protect the mental health of the people sharing their experiences. This includes offering fair compensation for the emotional labor involved in sharing, ensuring that storytellers are part of the decision-making process, and following up after the story is shared to provide support and gratitude. It's also crucial to honor someone's identity fully, use the correct names, pronouns, and ensure that the storyteller feels seen and respected throughout the process. For us as queer youth, protecting our well-being while sharing our stories is non-negotiable. It's about creating safe spaces where our voices can be heard without harming ourselves in the process. So now that we've explored the power of intersectional storytelling supported by data and the importance of safeguarding our well-being in this work, it's time to hear from our panel of experts who will dive deeper into these themes. They each bring really unique perspectives on how intersectionality shapes their work, and I know their insights will be incredibly valuable. I'm now just going to pass each of the panelists to quickly introduce themselves, just noting that there is more about each panelist in the little bios that we have in the chat. All right, Alice will take it away.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Before we just jump to the panelists, we're just asking them to jump on, like to come on board. Also can see a lot of you attending, which is awesome jumping in. Keep just a reminder that the session will be recorded. So if you just miss the introduction, you can go back and record it, but you've come in at the most juicy part anyway. So we'd love to pass on to the panelists to do a quick introduction to themselves. And as you said, you guys would be able to see the actual written descriptions that you can see as well. So without further ado, I will pass on to Nevo, if you want to open up and do an introduction of yourself, and then we can popcorn from there.
Cool. Hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just here on the land of the Wurundjeri Willem clan, and have lived here at a meeting point where many Kulin nations peoples have lived and grown and hunted and fished and told stories for tens of thousands of years. So I'm just really grateful to be here, and just acknowledging that sovereignty was never ceded. This was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land, and just pay my respects to the storytellers of this country and of this land for tens of thousands of years and many generations. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Maybe we'll pass over to Narissa.
Hey everyone, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here with you all. I'm joining from the land of the Darug people and pay my respects as well to the traditional custodians of the land here and all the lands that we're joining on from today. I am a keynote speaker, a neurotransformational coach, and a speaker coach and author as well. My background is from India. I grew up there. I identify as a gay non-binary person of color. And growing up there, I was told that a lot about me was not acceptable, and I had to live in a certain box. And over the years, I've had to step out and rewrite my story and recreate the identity that I live and feel comfortable in today. So, pleasure to be here with you all today and to chat about intersectional voices and stories.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Narissa. And Moji, we'll pass on to you.
Hi, I'm Moju. Firstly, thank you, Navar, for that very thorough and beautiful acknowledgement. I too am coming to you from Wurundjeri lands. My background, well, I have ties to Wiradjuri country, Dubbo. My mother is First Nations Wiradjuri from Tabaga Nation. My father is from the Philippines, Negros Occidental, in the Visayan Islands. So I have the very I don't know. It's certainly not unique, but it's a particular perspective of being a third culture person as well as a third gender person. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a musician, primarily songwriter, and a lot of what I do is storytelling, in particular, kind of legacy sort of work, a lot of family or kind of cultural work. I think that I've definitely stepped into a place of, you know, some at times being a cultural practitioner as well as, you know, an artist first and foremost. That's what I love. And I also work in many other disciplines, in art making. I have a pretty broad art making practice, but most people know me for my music, so that's who I am.
Thank
Alice, if I could just jump in, if that's okay.
Oh,
I realized that
certainly.
I didn't actually introduce myself. I was just at a high school doing a presentation, and year nines are really scary. So I'm still really a bit flustered, and they asked a lot of really hectic questions about transness. So hi everyone, my name is Navor. I use they them pronouns. I'm a public speaker. Actually, I want to introduce myself not as my work first, because I think we can create those associations too quickly. The lands that have shaped me are I'm shaped in my bloodline. I'm Ashkenazi Jewish, shaped by Poland, Russia, France, and also Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country, and Bunurong country is where I've lived my whole life. I have a legacy of colonization on this land as a third generation settler colonizer, and I also have a legacy of colonization on stolen Palestinian land as well, and really just want to hold in my heart everything that is happening right now. I don't think we can have any kind of conversations around intersectional storytelling without really honoring where we are at this point in time. So I do a lot of work with writing. I'm a writer. I've written a couple of books about gender, and I'm a poet, and I do a lot of educational work on trans stuff. But I'm also a really big mushroom nerd, and that's my main special interest. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for introducing yourself. And hopefully this will be a little bit more gentle than having to tell your story to a bunch of year nine teenagers. I know we were all pretty scary at year nine as well, but yeah, hopefully we'll have a bit more of a gentle discussion and be able to have more of a dialogue amongst all of us as well. So thank you for reclaiming that space and telling your story a bit more. Brilliant. I know we've got Josh and Alexander, so I might popcorn to you, Alexander, if you're ready to do a quick introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to start by recognizing that I empathize with Neva because the work that I'm doing at the moment has me working with a group of year nine boys in a high school as well once a week. So my name is Alexander. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm joining from the lands of the Jurunganj people of the Yuin Nation, which, for anyone who's not aware, is I'm on the Sapphire Coast, far south coast of New South Wales. Josh is also joining from the same lands. So I currently work by day as a youth peer support worker, so working with people from the ages of 12 to 25, which is a combination of one-on-one peer work and some group work, which is the stuff I'm doing in the schools in the area. And I'm feeling really grateful to be rewriting my own narrative here, starting as, one of the first openly trans people in my area, having moved to Melbourne for 7 years to kind of find myself a bit more, find my community a bit more, and now being able to come back and kind of help to shape a more healthier, more informed kind of experience of the area for young queer and trans people where I grew up. I feel very privileged to be doing that kind of work to, help shape futures a little nicer than the experience I had of coming out in high school here. And while I was in Melbourne for the last 7 years, I just moved back here about 6 months ago. I was working as a drag performer and a queer events manager, coordinator, shaper. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. Oh, I identify as a trans man. I didn't make that apparent, but yeah, so that's, that's a little bit about me, but I'm sure we'll get more into it as the panel progresses a bit.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alexander. I think you've raised actually a really good point, which is particularly in the light of the conversation we're having today about storytelling. I find sometimes introducing ourselves can be really tricky, particularly when there's so many layers that we identify with. And so, yeah, sometimes, we have temporary amnesia about things that are really important and dear to us or how we identify as well. So I know we all probably relate to having those moments. Brilliant. And then Josh, you're the last of the panel to introduce yourself. So I'll pass over to you and then we'll carry on.
Hi everyone, my name is Joshua Munro. I also go by Tequila Mockingbird. That is my drag performance name. My pronouns are they, she, he, so any and all used interchangeably as you would like. I'm also coming to you from the unceded stolen lands of the Jurunganj people of the Yuin Nation here on the Sapphire Coast. I am a multidisciplinary artist who has wealth and breadth and knowledge and performance experience dating back to when I was 5 years old in 1995. I performed across all different facets across musical theatre, television, drag performance is where I've ended up for the last 16 years. I work a lot in advocacy, sort of bridging the gap between older and newer generations of queer people, especially those coming to the art form of drag, because I find that a lot of our forebearers, our forefathers and foremothers were lost and those stories aren't being told anymore. And there is a huge divide between that. So that's sort of what I do as my drag job. But as for my day job, I work for St. Vincent's de Paul. Since I came to the Sapphire Coast, I'm now assistant manager of a Vinnie's, which is really exciting.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being so generous in spirit with sharing your story, especially right off the gun. I think, although many of us in the panel here are very well practiced in telling our story, I think we can all remember a time where that was quite a scary prospect, or to completely embrace our story and be able to show that vulnerability to share with others. Used to be quite scary for many of us and maybe sometimes still is. So thank you. for stepping into this space and for sharing your spirit as well. All right, so we'll jump into the first question, and hopefully this kind of evolves into a little bit more of an organic conversation, because I feel like that's where the best conversations have. That's where the best kind of ideas come from. So even though we have a few questions we're going to use to structure the conversation, feel free to jump off each other, or if anything resonates with you, to add where you think might be important to raise as well. But given that today's session is about intersectional storytelling, I thought probably the best kind of leaping pad point to jump off from would be maybe we can all share a bit of a moment or a reflection that where we have felt empowered by sharing your own intersectional narrative or your own intersectional story. What impact did that have on you, and also those who heard your story? What was the impact of that? I know it's a bit of a broad question, but I will leave it up to whoever wants to jump in to start with that, and we can just get the ball rolling.
I'm happy to kick things off. So I think back to a time, when I first shared my story. I think what you were just saying, Alice, it is kind of confronting sometimes to share a story. And sometimes we can think and wonder, like, why does my story matter? Or who is this going to resonate with? Or this is just my story. And is it really important? Like, does my voice even matter to share that story? And I think when I first wanted to share my story, I didn't even know how to, or which part to share, and all of that kind of negative chatter plays in your head. And I remember just being a guest on a podcast, and someone just asking about my story, and we just kind of chatting pretty organically. And I didn't know even the impact of what that would have, but I had messages coming back from people that I had never met from the other side of the world, parents and teachers, uh, saying, thank you for sharing my story, because now you've given me a different perspective to have a conversation with my kid, or, I can look at something differently. And that made me think, like, wow, there is so much power in storytelling, and so much power in putting faces to a story, like us not just being another number or data or statistics, but actually voices of people that have these stories, and that have these stories through the different intersectionalities, which then prompted me to write my first book, which is called Growing Through, which is the journey of me coming out and how coming out transformed my life. And the response to that and people reading that story, and it was pretty vulnerable, because as you probably know as well as some of us authored the book, once it's out there, it's just out there. And yeah, it's pretty vulnerable, but to understand the impact that can make. And I often say that, the experiences that we've gone through are our experiences, but when we share the story, it is for someone else. And if, a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old can read that story, even a teenager at any point, even parents and adults can read that story and go, okay, maybe I can think about this a different way, or I can have a different conversation, then it's worth sharing those stories. And I hope that we can create more spaces and give more voices to people that want to share their story from such diverse lenses.
Totally. If no one wants to jump in there, I think like something that just like came off in my mind when you're talking about that is about visibility as well. And I think visibility is such an important part to storytelling as well. And I think now I often have conversations, particularly with young leaders, who I think we have to often remind others that they're not the leaders, not only of tomorrow, but of today as well. And I think like one of the common denominators you hear about what's given them the courage to step into those leadership positions is being able to see people like them as well and hear stories like them. And it seems like such a simple concept, I think. And I think when you talk to people who perhaps haven't experienced the same adversity as those of us in the queer community, or those who have multiple identities that way, it seems like quite a complicated concept. They're like, what do you mean? But their stories have been the dominant narrative, right? They've always been visible. And I think like slowly there seems to be a growing understanding of how important that is, particularly when being able to embrace diversity as well. Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in on there and share their experience? Josh, you want to go? Yeah.
I came to my transness, as it were, quite late. So I'm 34 this year, and I've never really identified as any particular gender. I've never been particularly male. I've never been particularly female. I've sort of always fallen in and blurred the lines of what, as an AMAB person, what gender is. And it wasn't until I met my partner, Alexander McQueen, that I was able to really put a name to it. And so I identify as agender, and like I said before, any and all pronouns. But it wasn't until meeting Alex and through seeing his willingness and openness to just be himself and be so proud to be who he is, I sort of went, oh, why do I keep feeling like I need to jump into one box or another? Why do I feel like I need to label myself when I can just be me? And I've always just been me. And I think a real turning point for me was I got to perform in a show in Nam, and it was Anna Piper Scott's Tea for Tea at oh my goodness, the Toff upstairs, the Toff in town. And I put together a performance of Liza Minnelli's version of a Charles Aznavour song called What Makes a Man a Man. And it's about someone who, during the war, was like the Second World War, was a cabaret singer in a lounge and would go out dressed as a woman and would constantly have their gender questioned and this, that, and the other. And I found, as I went through the lyrics of it and as I sort of gained a deeper understanding of it, and relate it to my experience, I was like, this is so important because there are so many people out there who will tear you down for being who you are. And who says that they have the right to do that? And it was a really pivotal moment for me. It was a really moving performance where I started out in drag, and as the number progressed, I took everything off, all the costumes, the lashes, the wig, the makeup, and I ended just as myself on stage. And it was a really, really powerful moment. And in that moment, when the song came to an end and you could hear like a pin drop in the audience, and I was like, this feels like it's changed a part of me, being able to express this with a wider community and with other people in the world, and for people to be able to see me finally for who I am. And it was just in a really emotional moment. And I performed the same number again later down the track at another trans performance night at the Science Works in and it got the same reaction. And I had people coming up to me saying, you don't know how much this has helped me and how much just this performance. And people quite often just view drag as, yes, a lot of it is activism, but a lot of it is just like silly fluff. And you see them on Drag Race and it's just a lip sync to a song. But to see something like that pivotally change me and potentially start an awakening in other people was a really special moment, and not something that I'd experienced prior to that within my like performance career.
What a huge moment of vulnerability and also exposure as well, which I think takes a lot of strength and courage. I think an imperfect kind of like visual example of that as well. But I think that's something we constantly are battling and wrestling with, right? About like how safe are we to actually be our full most naked selves and be able to embrace or give ourselves that space as well. I know I've definitely not mastered it. I don't think any of us really learned to master it, right? It's a constant learning journey. But I would have loved to have been there to have like just held space in that room with everyone else. I'm sure a lot of people had significant takeaways from that. Moju, I'm going to jump to you because I know you were eager to jump in.
Oh, yeah, I was just everyone was being a little bit polite, or maybe like overly polite, a little bit shy even. So I was like, I'll volunteer myself, throw myself in the ring. No, I was just going to say that I mean I've been working in the music industry for over 20 years. And I think early in my career, I again was just being. There wasn't a lot of deep thought into, I guess, how that was perceived, how I was being perceived. It was more just that I was existing. I think I grew up in in regional New South Wales, kind of through the 80s and the 90s, and it was pretty difficult kind of upbringing. And so I moved to the city and I got really far away, and I just felt like all of a sudden I could just be myself and express myself however, so that I you know, without consequence, I thought. And it wasn't until probably, you know, like a few years into my career, I made my first solo record. I'd been in a band and we're doing this thing, and I made my first solo record where I kind of really felt like I've got something that I want to say about, you know, who I am in the world. And so a lot of it was like, you know, it was very, like, aesthetically it was very noir, like it was very film noir-esque. And like there was this, because that was, you know, something that I really loved these old films, and I loved a lot of, you know, I grew up on jazz and blues music, so that was like kind of foundational to who I was. But I wanted to subvert those genres because I felt like, you know, queer people didn't exist in those narratives. And you know, AFAB people were not treated particularly well in those narratives. And so I made this record, and I don't know necessarily if the kind of mainstream listeners really got what I was doing, but I think it really struck a chord with you know, queer communities that I was kind of connected to. And I definitely think that it ruffled feathers within these, you know, kind of more heteronormative spaces. Like people were like really bothered. I could sense that people were really bothered by my masculinity and the way that I kind of took on this persona as like a real crooner, you know. And I was very like, and this is like I'm talking, well, that's this album probably came out around 2012, but I'd been sort of doing that for a minute already as an artist. And I could, yeah, it really it rubbed some people the wrong way, particularly in my industry, like and so I knew that is how I knew I was being successful at what I was doing. And then from there I kind of, you know, I've had a real love-hate relationship with the industry, because I've been told outright and kind of point blank that I wouldn't be successful in the industry because I was too much, like I was too queer and too brown and too challenging for people. They didn't really know what to make of me or where to put me, and that was not going to do well commercially. And I kind of kept on keeping on, and funnily enough, it was my third solo album that really you know, I think I'd had a very successful career up until that point in a more like slightly underground kind of thing, but I was still making a living and doing what I loved. And I was operating in the commercial industry to some respect. But I think I really had this breakthrough moment when I made an album called Native Tongue, and that sort of changed my life, and really like did not anticipate that. I was just have a very close relationship with my grandparents, and I kind of I wanted to tell their stories before they passed on. And so for me, that was about honoring them. It was about honoring family, but it was also about this reckoning with myself and kind of allowing myself to step into all of my intersecting identities. Like it was really about that. I wrote a song, the song Native Tongue, and it is explicitly for me about being both Filipino and First Nations, like being of like a second generation migrant. And I grew up in the 90s in regional Australia, where there was a very loud kind of anti-Asian sentiment, anti-migrant sentiment, and also being First Nations, and kind of never feeling like I belonged in either of those spaces. It was about me kind of acknowledging all these different parts of who I was and allowing myself to take ownership of those, because I felt that I would always tread very lightly in all of these spaces because I wasn't Black enough, or I wasn't Asian enough, or I wasn't enough of these things, but I also wasn't white enough. And so that was really hard. And so I made this record, and I put it out into the world, and I really didn't know that I didn't think people were going to hear it. And it just happened to kind of catch a real zeitgeist moment where everybody was having a conversation, or was just about to have that conversation, and then the song came out, and then it was just like I got thrust into the middle of a kind of political conversation that I wasn't necessarily prepared for. And it was really hard, and it was really exposing, and I felt that I was under all this scrutiny, and people were kind of dissecting my identity, and people wanted to quantify my blood. Like, they wanted to know, how much percent are you of this, and how much percent are you of that, and all of these things, and really missed the point actually of what the song was about, and what the story was about, and actually how rich the whole album was in kind of telling, like, I guess, like, in a way, like, it was contributing to songlines and telling family history, and like as my job as a storyteller in the family. That is my job, is to kind of commit those things to memory, and create, commit those things to songlines, and create those legacies. That is a huge part of what my job is, as well as like just distilling emotion. I think distilling those feelings down into these kind of sound bites that people really connect with. But I think, despite all of the challenges of that, the overwhelming thing was how much feedback I got, like an astounding, like I've never experienced before or since, the amount of people that came to me and were like, that song resonates with me for this reason, and from countless different backgrounds. So it was like, it didn't matter how many generations their family had been here, it didn't matter what intersecting identities they had, but it was all these people, so much about belonging and needing to, this sense of not belonging, or like longing for that and needing to belong. And I think that was an incredible lesson for me in the responsibility of being a storyteller, and how important these stories are to tell, how valid they are. Like, no matter if somebody tells you you're not enough of this or not enough of that, it's actually, it isn't about any of those things. It's actually about occupying the in-between spaces as well, and that they're very much valid stories to be told. And it's funny, it's like people want to be able to categorize. It's really part of like human nature to want to like categorize things and put them in little pigeonholes and understand it. And when you kind of defy that, then you really do, it's confronting for people, but it's also like, we're all these rich, every one of us is this rich tapestry of all these things. And I think if you can really speak to the heart of that, that is such an incredible privilege to be,
I just want no, absolutely. I just want to touch on like a few things that you've said. I think something that really resonated with me that you just said was this longing for connection and longing for belonging as well. And I think which I think every single one of us can relate to. And also what you were saying before about how we live in a world, and actually it's a symptom of living in a heteronormative, patriarchal, capitalist society, is that our brains have been hardwired and conditioned to categorize ourselves, right? And be like, well, those are my people, those aren't my people. And when people don't fit within these binary means, they become a threat almost, or our brain doesn't compute. And I think that's where we see a lot of that anger or kind of rejection come from, and that's incredibly hurtful as well. But I think another thing I wanted to tap on is something that I really couldn't help but pick up on. But for you saying that one of, I guess, like one of the indicators that tells you that you're actually making headway and you're making change is when you have that backlash, or when you have that, like when people are having that reaction to you, that's like, oh, I've got you. And I think that it's really interesting. I think particularly we're living in where that kind of social volatility is quite normal, unfortunately, where like, and I think because we've had this pendulum swing of social changes and social norms. And so I think when those of us who are in story positions where we're sharing our stories or identify as a storyteller or as a leader or a change maker, whatever it might be, it's a really difficult spot to kind of identify as like, this is a good thing, I'm making change, but when it can be quite hurtful at the same time. I've just had and I'm mindful of time, but I've had someone come message me, and as I said, I knew this was going to grow into a bit more of an organic conversation, but I want to open the floor to other people as well. I've had someone come and just message me and say, how they something that they really wrestle with is competing identities within themselves, particularly if they've been told or or their experience is that these two things can't coexist, or it's one or the other, or I have to fit within these binary means. And I'm curious as to whether people can share from their own experiences, perhaps elements of their own identity that they might be wrestling with themselves currently. I mentioned previously when Josh was talking about that, having that vulnerability and exposure in our stories, that can be really scary. And especially we're wrestling with our own sense of self. But I'm curious as to perhaps, and I'm Alex and Never, I'd love to hear from you too, but like what your experiences have been wrestling with your own identity, particularly if you've been told that they can't coexist, or you can't have a sense of self with these two ideas.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I just wanted to say, I just loved everything you shared so much, Moj. That was just like really, I felt really moved by what you shared. I think it's, there were so many threads in that I wish we could have an entire conversation just on what you mentioned. But it really conjured for me something that Auntie Rhonda Grosvenor Dixon said up on Gadigal Country when she was closing the 24-hour Grumble Boogie event, and she said, "Don't be greedy by keeping your magic to yourself." And I just like really hold on to that. And I heard another quote another time that said, "Imposter syndrome is an insult to your ancestors." And I think like this is something I'm grappling with a lot at the moment, is because of celebrity culture and because of celebrity worship, and also because of the egos that exist for all of us, whether it means that we rise above the collective or whether it means we put ourselves down below the collective. Both of those are incredibly kind of ego driven. And when you are like a storyteller, or you are kind of out there trying to like embody your magic, it can sometimes be really misunderstood that you think you're more magic than anyone else, or you think you're better than anyone else. And it's something like Adrienne Maree Brown has talked about a little bit, of like embodying spirit. Sometimes people will misunderstand you as like more sacred, or thinking that you're more sacred or something like that. But actually that energy is something that passes through all of us. And when we can really embody our own magic in that way, we can all really shine together as a collective. And I think that's something that I'm really trying to like find the right spots in. And those projections and parasocial relationships and all that kind of stuff can make it really really complicated. But I think at the moment, like I'm in like I've described it as like a goo stage. Essentially that I'm like in the chrysalis. Here's like a little chrysalis I got this year. Just like kind of falling apart to become something new. Like I have no idea what I'm becoming yet. But I found out recently that caterpillars have like imaginal cells. Like that's what they're actually called, imaginal cells, that like they're cells that do not know what they're going to be yet. And I think there's something so cool about that. And I feel like at the moment we're in such a time of history where kind of everything is turning to goo. Like everything's turning to shit in so many ways. And we don't really know where we're going to go and like what's going to happen. And it would be really disingenuous for me to like talk about, intersectional identity or whatever, and not talk about the fact that like I don't know. There is no life before like what's happened since October 7th. Like there is no or October 8th. Like there is no life before then. And of course things didn't start then. But I guess for me, like and it's so not a thing to center myself, but when speaking of my own lived experiences, like my intersectional identities, like I've never had a problem. I've never found my Jewishness and my experience as a Jewish person to be antithetical to my transness ever. It's only ever been the projection of other people. But what I have found is that my acceptance in Jewish communities as a trans person has been so profoundly reliant on my subscription to Zionist propaganda and ideology, because those the kind of Jewish world and like Zionism is like a disease that has infiltrated Judaism. It's like laid its eggs within our culture, and it's like turned ourselves against ourselves. Like it is an evil, it's imperialism, it's colonization, like it's a disease that infiltrates all of us, and that it tears us apart from each other and from ourselves. And so the amount of transphobia that I've experienced in my community from coming out as trans is really different than from coming out as an anti-Zionist. Like coming out as an anti-Zionist was the most controversial coming out I've experienced in my life. And I don't say that because I'm like, oh, boo-hoo, like that's really hard. Like I'm incredibly privileged. I've lived a very sheltered life, and I, operate in this colony as a white settler who looks and reads like a man. So like my experience is so unbelievably privileged. It's just so insightful, I think, to see how conditional that acceptance in a community is on how well you prescribe to the kind of decorum, like if you can still agree with your kind of family propaganda, you get to be gay or you get to be trans, or if you're lucky, and that's just within that space. So yeah, I think at the moment I'm really like unpacking what does it mean to be connected to my culture, and especially when my culture is so reliant upon communal celebration and being together with other people, when everyone who's ever taught me about injustice in my growing up is a genocide apologist, who I no longer have any contact with, and I still don't feel like my Judaism and my transness, or my Judaism and my anti-colonial, anti-imperialist politics are at odds with each other, but that doesn't mean lots of other people don't feel that way. So I think even what Moju said about, like, at the end of the day, we're not really answering to those ideas. Like the thing that I draw myself back to is I answer to the land, I answer to my ancestors, I answer to my descendants, I answer to God, whatever that might look like, and I answer to my teachers and like the people that I really respect, and whose values I really align with, and I have to keep like grounding down into that. And I think to kind of weave it back to that above the collective or below the collective, like this thing that I've had to balance over the last 10 months and also just over my lifetime is like equally holding I am incredibly important and I'm not important at all. And that if I like fall too far into either of them, if I think I'm incredibly important, then like, I get an inflated sense of self, I get an inflated ego. I also can't take breaks and I can't take rest because I'm too important to step away from something, and then if I fall too far on the other end, I become despairing, I become hopeless. I feel like, what's the point of showing up? What's the point of doing anything? Who am I? I don't even matter. And so I feel like my kind of like intersectional identity is like also just trying to figure out how to hold these multiplicities at the same time and how to exist in the goo, which I think is a very non-binary way of existing, is like getting to the goo and being like, this is actually final form. Like I'm happy with this. I just want to be full of imaginal cells and not know what's coming next and surrender to that,
Yeah. Totally. I think I just want to like talking about the goo. I think like we're all messy people, right? Like I think we're all messy. Our histories are messy. And I guess what I'm hearing from you right now speaking is that like at least your entire life, if not like the last year in itself, has been in real reckoning with your sense of identity, with your sense of self, with your spirituality, with who you identify as. And that can be a real smack in the face, especially where you're like, holy crap, I do not like, especially as like when we are constantly trying to evolve into a new space and we're like, I don't have the tools to be able to work through this just yet. It can be incredibly confronting and scary and hard and exhausting and all those things, but it can also be almost this phoenix moment where you get this entire like you feel re-energized by your sense of spirituality and self and find a new relationship with yourself as well.
I
And
just
I
want to really, really
yeah,
quickly say as well that I think there's such a falsity around transition too that
yeah,
really fucks us. Like
yeah,
this idea that you can be pre-transition or post-transition or
yeah.
pre-op or post-op or like when did you transition? Like that
Mm,
question shits me to no end because I'm like right now.
mm,
Like I'm in transition right now. And if I stop transitioning, that's when the red flags come up. Like,
yeah.
and I think for me, that idea of linearity and like that you can get to a certain point, which is just very colonial thinking,
Mm,
is it traps you because then when you discover a new aspect of your identity and you get really dysphoric suddenly because oh shit, I'm actually not a binary trans man, I'm actually
yeah,
non-binary, or
yeah.
damn, I actually want to present in this way, or like I'm actually this, you know, and then it really traps you because you're like, I thought I was done, I thought I
Mm.
was finished, and it's like, baby, you're like 25, like why would you be finished? Like you just started, like you don't even know who you are. And not only that, but like we're humans, like humans are so new to this planet, you know, like humans are so new, we're babies. Like look at the fungi, look at the ferns, like look at the, you know, like look at the trees hundreds of years, like who do we think we are? Like we don't know what we're doing, you know, like we're just learning from the soil, you know. And so I think that really traps us too, is the way that we just like reinvent that kind of language into our own communities that then yeah, it traps us.
Totally, it traps us, and I think there's like constantly talk going back to that, bringing how we operate, and all these things are symptomatic of these like much broader structures that we're living and existing within. And one of those things being like ongoing and continuing colonial violence or coloniality. And I think like at the heart of that is this idea of conquest, right? And so like we have this idea of like I have to complete something, or I have to complete this transition, or I have to complete like I have to whatever it is, whatever the challenge I might be facing, I need to conquer it and complete it, and I need to overcome it. And I think with our identity, this concept of conquesting it is really kind of counter to how we know these things evolve and grow. And so I think, no, thank you for sharing that story. I think it was a great example of how we are constantly wrestling within ourselves. And just to, another thing that came up to my mind then is I have a wonderful therapist. But one thing she always reminds me of is that the hardest relationship we will ever have is the one we have with ourselves. We spend the most time in our head, the most time with like with what we wrestle with. And so being able to, in the same way as we work on relationships, we need to work on our own identity, the relationship we have with our identity as well. I want to pass over to Alexander because I want to give you some space to talk as well. So, um, I know that, and I knew this would happen, and I'm great. You know, we have so much rich conversation happening. But, Alexander, I want to give you the floor. We know we've had a number of really rich conversations, but what's resonating for you? What's coming to mind?
There are so many parts of everyone's stories here that have really resonated with my journey. And I think that's a really powerful part of the sharing process, is not only being able to show ourselves, but to welcome people in and share our connected stories and the ongoing themes within our communities. A couple of things that I resonate with between Nevo and Moju is firstly that exploration of what my transness means to me and the way that I present that. And part of that for me was exploring drag, and that's why I got into it. I'd started hormones and I'd had top surgery, and I was feeling a little more confident with how I was being interpreted in the day to day and how people were kind of assuming me in public. And so I wanted to take that opportunity to kind of step back and go, okay, what parts of my previous lives before I started exploring my gender am I ready to welcome back in? And I used drag to explore parts of my femininity from my past and kind of rework them in ways that fitted who I was at the time and who I am now. Um, and really create a more fluid journey of my gender expression and kind of pickpocket from previous identities. And I really resonated with some of what Moji was saying about stepping into the music industry and kind of facing a lot of backlash, because part of my, debut in the drag community was actually being booed off stage at my first gig by a group of cis men who didn't appreciate the message that I was bringing as a trans person, and especially as an AFAB person in what is surprisingly a very male dominated and at times very patriarchal society of drag performers. Because I mean, it is this really fantastical art form that has its roots in, gender fuckery. And unfortunately, because of some of those more mainstream presentations of drag, like Drag Race, it's become almost a smaller and smaller box of validity with each season that goes to air. And what started as a really punk rock kind of art form has become another box to fit into for the sake of validity on what people are expecting from drag because of those shows and other things. And so I stepped into this space thinking, like, I'm ready to explore my gender. I want to expand my gender and what that means to me. And I want to expand the realm of visibility for trans men like myself, because I think another issue I had with the early stages of my transition was that there wasn't a lot of visibility at the time for trans masculine people. And a lot of what I was seeing was very cis passing, very athletic, able bodied white men. And even though I tick a lot of those boxes, I wasn't kind of seeing myself reflected in the visibility and the opportunities that I was seeing, and trying to find a different way to navigate it myself that welcomed other people feeling those same feelings into my journey. So a lot of that was doing really kind of fluid expressions of masculinity and at times very feminine presentations of masculinity in the way that I felt it and the way I wanted to express it. And by welcoming people into that journey, I actually had a lot of people come to me and say, hey, I've always kind of deep down felt like a gay man, but as an AFAB person, I was really at odds with that and thought, oh, well, that must make me non-binary, because, you can't be trans masculine and also be feminine. And seeing me kind of explore that publicly in quite a vulnerable and open way allowed other people to see themselves in that story and then give themselves permission to explore themselves in the same way and come to different conclusions. But it also came with a lot of backlash from cis people, cis men largely within the drag community, saying, well, that's not what drag is. When, if we look back to the pioneers of drag, it was that. If we look at people like Divine, and if we look at some of the trans women of color that shaped the earliest history of drag, it was very radical and it was such a broad range. So it was, a really confronting and unexpected kind of pipeline for my transition for a while. But it also created some really beautiful connections to other people within the community that felt like they didn't have that sense of belonging within themselves or within the larger queer community. So it was a difficult but quite empowering journey that welcomed a lot of people in, that helped me to then be able to explore and expand my own ideas of self, as well as, gender as a broader concept. As pompous as that sounds, there is something really vulnerable about, using your body or your voice as your canvas for the art that you're doing and the stories that you're telling. And it is a really vulnerable space to occupy when it feels like a criticism of your art is also a criticism of you as a person and, as a spirit navigating the messed up society that we have these days. So I really resonated with a lot of points from a lot of people's stories today, because I think, these are the things that we often come across as intersectional storytellers.
I think I want to. I love what you came up about a sense of belonging and connection. I think that's been a theme that's come out, sporadically throughout this as well. And I had like a message come through to me from someone who I one of the participants I've been speaking quite closely with, and from the conversation, like really wrestling with this sense of having that multi, can't remember the word it was, multi-duplicity that we have in our identity. But like one of the things that's come up is a sense that this sense of belonging and connection. I guess like the counter to that is a sense of like that alienation and exclusion from community as well. And I think that and I think this is it's hard to divorce this from our identity as well, and it's hard to divorce from who we represent as within ourselves, because I guess we see like I connect to this, I connect to that, but there are things we don't connect to as well. And I think something I think perhaps we can all relate to within the queer community is this is something that is not alien to the queer community either. There is quite a lot of discrimination that we face within ourselves, and I think again that is symptomatic of these broader oppressive structures, whether we look at heteronormity, our internalized heteronormity, or our internalized ideas of what we need to form and what we need to bind to. I'm curious as to like how we, obviously one of the things that probably fuels all of us is the hope for a more inclusive society that embraces that diversity and kind of rejects these binary structures in place. But what role do you see, I guess, storytelling having within our own queer community, and how do we start to dismantle perhaps a lot of those biases and discriminations we have within ourselves? I think, and part of that is to segue, we've spoken about how we wrestle with that within ourselves and our own identity, but how do we, I guess, expand that to the community within ourselves as well? I don't know if that's a bit abstract, but feel free to jump in. Or Alex, if you want to, seeing as we're already speaking, do you want to take the lead on this one?
Yeah. I mean, what I would hope for the future of our community is that we find a way to, rather than repurposing the boxes that we as queer people are put in and, putting that onto other people within our community, to collectively kind of go, well, why do we need to fit into these boxes? And rather than creating our own boxes, just doing away with boxes altogether, which is easier said than done, I guess. But I think the more storytellers that we have that are willing to share this vulnerability with the broader community, the easier that will become through like collective consciousness, I guess. Working with young people, I mean, we often talk about, the dangers of what is becoming of social media these days, and especially things like TikTok. But something that I often talk about with my co-workers is actually like there are some really beautiful things coming out of that as well. Like having grown up rural and really jostled with my gender before I even knew, that trans people existed or what that meant or what that felt like, because of my isolation from, more progressive communities. Like there are children now growing up here that have access to these online communities through, media like TikTok, where they are seeing people's stories and they're seeing different people who identify under maybe the same labels, but who explore that and express that in a million different ways, and being able to see themselves better reflected in the wider world, and having, more ability to explore outside of labels and outside of binaries and those limitations, and giving themselves the space to go, well, I don't need to know the answer right now, but I also don't need to stop myself from exploring that or just trying and seeing how it feels. I think there's more discussion about, following euphoria instead of feeling restricted by dysphoria, and different conversations like that, which I think always give me a little bit of hope in the grand scheme of the hopelessness of the internet. I think there are some really beautiful stories and journeys coming out of having that broader and deeper connection, especially in isolated communities.
I think the underlying message I'm hearing from you, at least, and I could be well off piste, but is that like but storytelling, part of that storytelling journey is about reclaiming that narrative and reclaiming that agenda or that language, so that it actually reflects us and serves us as well. And that can be usually quite a tricky terrain to be able to navigate. But I think to connect to those who we did a session about bell hooks and this love ethic and community, but I think when you're doing things through like seeking connection and love and belonging, it naturally is like it is the natural antidote to these systems of oppression that we are constantly living within and operating within. I'm gonna spitball it to the other panelists, and I know we might try to wrap it up by in the next like 10 minutes if we can. And I know I don't want to cut conversations short, but would love, yeah, if there's any kind of like final, like of the richness of the conversation, if there's any kind of final messages you guys want to share with the panel, the rest of the attendees, now would be the time to do it.
I was just going to jump in and I just say, I think as intersectional storytellers, I think something that is so important is not letting our history die, whatever that may be. And we all come from different backgrounds and we all come from different walks of life. And it's about telling those stories and keeping those stories alive so that those future generations know what came before them and so that they can carry that mantle on. And I speak solely from an AMAB drag queen perspective, but it is the history of those people that fought. Like I said before, it's the generation before me as drag performers who all sadly we lost to the AIDS epidemic. And now there seems to be such a gap where we lost so many of our own in that time. And it was trans women, it was trans men, it was sex workers, it was everyone. It was all encompassing across our entire beautiful rainbow. And I think keeping those stories alive is so important moving forward, because that's where people tend to start to forget that the first Pride was a riot, and that's where we need to be. That's where we need to stay. It's to continue moving forward for the future generations, I think.
Yeah, just touching on some of the things you said there, Josh, I think even some of the history that we're taught about our community is erasing some of that intersectionality and some of those more marginalized identities within the community. Because, I mean, part of my experience as a trans man is not seeing myself reflected in the histories that we're taught and seeing a lot of erasure. But if you dig enough, like we've always been there, and the same could be said of a lot of intersectionalities within our community. It's just that, you know, this cis white heteronormative patriarchy that we live under isn't just affecting the way we see our present, it's also affecting the way that we see our past and the way that we see our future. And so I think it's something that we have to be really aware of within ourselves and the way that we explore our past, present, and future, and be mindful of the experiences that differ to our own as much as looking for experiences that we resonate with.
I think just going on what you said as well, I think similar to how our own experiences with identity and community, the past, present, and future isn't binary either, right? I think if we look at the legacy of coloniality, I mean, the fact that we live in a post-colonial world is bullshit. Sorry for my French, but it's bullshit. You know, like we continue, like in fact, like you know, the reality of colonial violence happens every day in everyone's experiences and is actually quite omnipresent. So I think like when we're talking about past, present, and future, it's so important to be able to know where we've come from, to know where to go. But I think, yeah, just it's that I just, as you were speaking, made that connection. I was like, none of this is binary, which also makes it, as Josh so wonderfully said, the goo that we of how we operate within. Yeah, Narissa, I want to go to you because we haven't heard from you a little while, so please jump in.
No, I'm just listening and I'm absorbing. Like, this is such a beautiful conversation to have, and I love how it's flowing. And I resonate so much with, you know, what y'all are saying. But when you talk about the evolution of identity and transition, and we'll touched a little bit on this with the chrysalis and the butterfly, like often when we think about transformation or that journey of becoming, we think about like, who am I becoming? And it's more of this person that we're becoming, when actually it's so much of unbecoming all the different things that people have told us we can't be. And when we think about the intersectionality of identities, you know, growing up in India, I didn't even know I was a person of color, because everyone in India is a person of color, right? In some form or shade. But the moment I came over to Australia, all of a sudden I'm now a person of color. And then it took me a long time to work through my sexuality. I didn't even have the concept growing up that gender could even be questioned or I could even explore it. And I think, and then if you think about like, you know, religion and how that plays in, for a long time, I couldn't be Indian and gay. I couldn't be Christian and gay. And working through those different identities, you know, so much resonates with what you were sharing as well. And around that, you know, sometimes and now coming out, it's easier for me to say, hey, by the way, I'm non-binary and gay than say I'm Christian, because it feels safer in some spaces. Which is just interesting. And I think when we talk about identity, and for the people listening, there's no time where we get as people when we're evolving through identity to just go, hey, by the way, I'm just going to shut out society and I'm going to go into a cave and I'm going to explore my identity. It's like we're driving the car whilst exploring the engine and figuring parts out. And there's no time that we get to pause on identity. It's this journey of evolution and constantly like learning. And the more we know about ourselves, the more we learn about other people, that continues. And I think for anyone listening, like back to what Alexander was saying, is like there's no finite, like there's no end point to it. And there's no thinking, well, if I'm here today, then I need to define and be in this box of who I am today. I think it's allowing ourselves the fluidity to keep morphing and to keep changing, and knowing that it's not right or wrong, it's absolutely who you are today. And when you're storytelling, I think, sometimes our narratives can go into like, how does my story fit with everybody else's? Or we compare our stories and identities to other people. And I think for listeners listening, like, I want you to hear that your story is beautiful because it is unique to you, and your identities and who you are is truly unique. And I think the world needs to hear from you, because you might be defining this whole other side, which we haven't heard or we want to hear about. So I think, don't limit yourself to just the narratives and the stories that we've heard up until this point, but allow the exploration of what can be.
I love what you just said. I mean, obviously about that exploration of identity, but what you said, like that exploration doesn't pause. There's no pause in identity. It is a constant matter that we are wrestling with. And I think that's like, it's said so simply, but a necessary reminder, I think, that this is not something that we get to tap in and tap out of. It's something that we are always kind of aware of. Moji, we'd love to jump to you and hear perhaps your passing words or some of the reflections that have emerged from you in this conversation.
There's I mean, everybody's said so many insightful and poignant things. I really loved everything that you just had to say, Narissa. That was, I really connected with that. And something you said as well just before, Josh, about, I guess, the generations of our communities, and I think you're really right. It's so important to kind of recognize whose shoulders we stand on, and also to kind of nurture. It's our responsibility as well to nurture those kind of future generations into becoming the leaders that they're gonna be. I feel like I'm constantly thinking about that, and just in my own kind of journey of becoming and evolving, and changing always. I too, I think, I think everybody said at some point they didn't see themselves necessarily, or they didn't see people like themselves reflected back at them, as they were growing up, or figuring out their identity. And I certainly didn't feel that. And as I've kind of gotten older, I've sort of realized that I can often be that to other people too. You have to, it's an interesting thing to kind of realize, is that sometimes you are that person, or sometimes you walk into a space and you are the person that's representing your community and all of that. So that's a really important thing to be mindful of. And I don't know, I also, just speaking on kind of the binaries and sort of my own gender as someone who exists kind of between in between spaces, as I was talking about before, I think I've always very much identified with my masculinity more. Like, that was always kind of where I felt most comfortable, was in my own masculinity. But I think being socialized as a female person, I was very reluctant to give up my connection to a sisterhood, and kind of feeling very much connected with that, and kind of learning that through like within my, particularly like in like Visayan culture and my Filipino heritage, that the the babaylan, or the like the spiritual, like the shamans, the witch doctors, they were often third gender, and kind of realizing that that is a really sacred space to hold, and there's a lot of responsibility with that, and there's also, yeah, it's that again, it's a real privilege to hold that space. And I don't know, I think that, you know, it's just as something that I sort of didn't really speak to before. I think I'm always thinking, about whose shoulders I stand on, and what my responsibilities are to future people, you know. What kind of ancestor do I want to be? You know, one day, if I'm lucky, I get to, yeah, you kind of be part of such a a rich and wonderful kind of legacy, um story, like tapestry of stories, you know, like there's just, yeah, there's there's so many stories to tell, there's so many stories that unfortunately we will never know, and haven't been told. But it's like, I think reflecting on that, and the fact that as being a storyteller is part of my identity, you know, that too. And that um I think for the longest time, you know, my identity as an artist was kind of the thing that was most urgent for me. It was like that is who I have to honor. And kind of now realizing how all of those things connect, even as my identity as a parent, you know, has kind of informed the kind of stories I want to tell, the urgency with which I need to tell certain stories, the kind of stories I want to make in my life, you know, for the future. So, you know, lots to think about. You're all so wonderful. I've really enjoyed listening to everyone's
Sorry.
stories today too.
Yeah, I love what you said just before, Maju, about how like being a part of your identity is being a storyteller. And I think that we can learn. I mean, for those who are, you know, I'm currently based up in the Northern Territory now in Bantua, working for the Aboriginal Legal Service, and something I'm still learning today is how to embrace more of that storytelling skills that I guess have been around for 60,000 years, and like evidence of 110,000 years of how that has evolved and the role that has. But I'm mindful of time, and I want to go to Never briefly. I'm sorry. I wish I could have done a better job at managing time, but the conversations have just been so rich and wonderful. So, Never, I will jump to you, and then I'll do my best to try leave people with a concluding thought. But I'll popcorn to you now.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, I resonate so much with what everyone's shared, and I really resonate with that idea of like being a storyteller, and that is such a key kind of identity for me. But I think being a storyteller means being a community member. Like, I think to be a storyteller is to be a story keeper, and is to be a listener. You can't tell stories if you're not listening. And that's not just stories about yourself, but that's yourself in relationship. And, you know, my mentor, Leah Manema, talks a lot about how all of the work that we need to do, like all of the liberation work that needs to happen, must be done relationally. There is actually no other way to do it. And there are a lot of people sometimes skipping that step in order to do the work faster. And that's just not how it works. And I think being in relationship, it's not just relationship with other humans, it's relationship with country, it's relationship with land, it's relationship with stories, it's relationship with, you know, everything, with the sky. And we're only as healthy or as sick as the land is, and the land is incredibly sick, you know, in this world that we live in. And so I think for me, like, I'm really moving into a stage of my life where I'm trying to cultivate much less certainty and much more curiosity, and just humility. Like, there's storytelling that's taken place on these lands for, as we've said, tens of thousands of years, and I don't know so many of those stories. I don't know barely anything about the land that I've lived on my entire life. Like, what does that really mean? And that land, like, has grown me. Like, I've lost every tooth on this land, you know. Like, I if I just went back to my own ancestral lands, I would still carry so much of this land with me because it's grown me, and yet I'm not in right relationship with it. So I want to try and cultivate a better listening practice around this country and around these stories that are here. And I think that that's kind of like the only way that, like, we can really, you know, move to better relationship. And I only learned recently that the word humility, or like humble, means in Latin of the ground, and like on the ground. So like to actually kind of absorb back into the earth in a way. And again, I think that links back to what I was saying about rising above or below the collective. You know, it's like the collective is also country, is also story, is also language, is also music and art, and all of those things. Like, when we can see this energy as something that's shared, I think that's where the best storytelling really gets to happen, in relationship like that.
Totally. Thank you so much. What a strong message to end on. And I think
one more thing I forgot to
yeah.
say. One more thing. I wanted to bring it back to the butterflies.
Yeah, okay, great. Go for it.
But something I learned recently is that monarch butterflies, they do this great migration across Turtle Island, right? And it doesn't take a day or 3 days or whatever. It takes like 3 or 4 generations. And just what you were saying, Mojo, about, you know, what's our responsibility to our descendants and to becoming a good ancestor. And I think about that stuff a lot. And I just think it's so beautiful that these butterflies start their migration knowing that they're never going to get to the end of it, but they don't say like, oh, well, I'm not getting to the end, so why should I start? Like, that's their responsibility, is to further along the migration path. And I keep thinking about, like, what's my role in the migration path? You know, like, I don't need to fix everything. I don't need, like, as if I could do that. Like, I'm not that important, you know, but I just am thinking about, like, what am I doing with this life, and where am I taking my bloodline? You know, where am I taking my bloodline? Where am I taking my community? And that's been a really, like, helpful thing when I find myself feeling despondent or despairing. Is it's like, I'm not finishing the migratory path. I'm just going my part.
Totally. I think, look, I love what you said. I think, like, sorry, I muted myself. Thank you. I think the role of, like, of humility, of curiosity, and I think also what you said about to be a storyteller is also to be a story keeper as well. And I think that's a brilliant message to kind of lead from. And it kind of leads on to last week we did a session where actually we looked at the leadership lessons of Ted Lasso. And there's this scene, I don't know if any of you know who Ted Lasso is, but it's a brilliant show. And when we need to disconnect from the world, I encourage you all to watch it because it's brilliant. But he talks about this role of curiosity and to be curious rather than judgmental, and the role that has in leadership. And I think also to have that humility, I think something that well, at least what I've heard from you just there is that humility is such an untapped resource when it comes to community change and advocacy and leadership itself. But I think humility is also the permission to realize that you can't do it all. The responsibility doesn't all lie on you. And as you've just spoken about then, to think that we can do it all is actually means that we're walking around with a huge ego in our head, to think that, well, I'm the Messiah now, that I'm going to fix everything. And it's not actually in the I said I live in the territory now, and we have a word for that, and that's called do-gooders. So those are the people that come here and go, well, now that I'm here, I'm going to fix everything. And I think it's a reminder to tap into that humility, not only as a tool for our own journey and the journey of becoming, as Moji said, but also to give us permission to not know everything and to continue on with that. I think it's no secret that, particularly in the queer space and in the advocacy space, we're planting seeds now that we're probably never going to see the shade of with the trees that are growing from it, right? I think when we look at the feminist movement that started 50, 60 years ago, and if they could have seen what emerged now, I think it probably would have been unimaginable. But they didn't stop them from, burning their bras and doing whatever it was that kind of kicked everything off. Beautiful. Look, I know I said I was going to try summarize what the richness of the conversation, but I'm not even going to attempt it because I think there's so much that's come from this conversation. And I know all of us that have been panelists and sat here, but those of us online as well have probably taken new messages and new learnings, which are so unique to our own journeys as well. So I'm not going to try to represent and summarize the conversations that emerged from tonight. Thank
Jump
you.
in for a second, Alice. I
Yes,
just wanted
of
to say I
course.
think you've actually been doing a really beautiful job of summarizing between each of our
Oh,
statements. And I don't think we need you to sit here now and try and encompass the whole thing, because you've been doing a really beautiful job of highlighting some of the emerging themes and facts from each of our stories as we've been going.
oh, thank you.
So I wanted to thank you as well for having us and for facilitating this space and making us feel so safe and appreciated.
Well, thank you. I hope I haven't made you feel like you're talking to a group of your 9-year-olds. That was not the intent. Beautiful. Well, thank you again for your generosity of spirit, of time, of vulnerability, of humility, of creativity. This has been extraordinary for me as someone who's sitting here listening to you and listening to your stories. And for those of you who are joining online, we have the details of all of those who are on the panelists tonight, who have very generously said that we can share their contacts if you want to get in touch with them or learn more from them. But thank you so much, everyone. And I hope, big hugs, wrapping you all in lots of love. I know that this was not only a fantastic and rich conversation, but quite a tricky conversation and a hard conversation to jump into as well. So please do what you need to do to wrap yourself in love, to make sure that you have those supports around you going home. Go hug your dog or your cat or your loved one or whatever it might be. Give yourself like a warm bath, whatever it might be. And also, as always, you guys know that if you ever need anything at all, we have a counseling support service as well. So thank you, everyone. Big hugs, and hope you all get through to Friday with lots of love and energy. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah.